And as per the agreed upon order of speakers, I'm going to call on Michelle Goldberg first. Michelle, would you like a sip of water? You can have a sip of water before you start. Call on Michelle Goldberg first for her 6 minutes of opening remarks. Michelle.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. As Rudyard knows, I initially balked a little bit at the resolution that we're debating because there are a lot of things that fall under the rubric of political correctness that I don't call progress. I don't like no platforming or Twitter or trigger warnings. Like a lot of middle-aged liberals, there are many aspects of student social justice culture that I find off-putting. Although I'm not sure that that particular generation gap is anything new. On the record about the toxicity of social media call-out culture, and I think it's good to debate people whose ideas I don't like, which is why I'm here. So if there are social justice warriors in the audience, I feel like I should apologize to you because I'm probably not, you're probably going to feel like I'm not adequately defending your ideas. But the reason I'm on this side of the stage is that political correctness isn't just a term for left-wing excesses on college campuses or people being terrible on Twitter. Especially as deployed by Mr. Peterson, I think it can be a way to delegitimize any attempt for women and racial and sexual minorities to overcome discrimination, or even to argue that such discrimination is real. In the New York Times today, Mr. Peterson says, quote, "The people who hold that our culture is an oppressive patriarchy, they don't want to admit that the current hierarchy might be predicated on competence." Now, that sounds particularly insane to me because I'm an American and our president is Donald Trump. But it's an assumption that I think underlies a worldview in which any challenges to the current hierarchy are written off as political correctness. I also think we should be clear that this isn't really a debate about free speech. Mr. Peterson once referred to what he called, quote, "the evil trinity of equity, diversity, and inclusivity," and said those three words, if you hear people mouth those three words, equity, diversity, and inclusivity, you know who you're dealing with and you should step away from that because it is not acceptable. He argues that the movie Frozen is politically correct propaganda, and at one point he floated the idea of creating a database of university course content so students could avoid postmodern critical theory. So in the criticism of political correctness, I sometimes hear an urge or an attempt to purge our thought of certain analytical categories that mirrors, I think, the worst caricatures of the social justice left that want to get rid of anything that smacks of colonialism or patriarchy or white supremacy. I also don't really think we're debating the value of the Enlightenment, at least not in the way that somebody like Mr. Fry, who I think is a champion of Enlightenment values, frames it. The efforts to expand rights and privileges once granted just to landowning white heterosexual men is the Enlightenment, or is very much in keeping with the Enlightenment. To quote a dead white man, John Stuart Mill, "The despotism of custom is everywhere the standing hindrance to human advancement." I think that some of our opponents, by contrast, frame challenges to the despotism of custom as politically correct attacks on a transcendent natural order. To quote Mr. Peterson again, each gender, each sex has its own unfairness to deal with. But to think of it as a consequence of the social structure, it's like, come on, really, what about nature itself? But there's an exception to this because he does believe in social interventions to remedy some kinds of unfairness, which is why in the New York Times he calls for, quote, "enforced monogamy" to remedy the woes of men who don't get their equal distribution of sex. When it comes to the political correctness debate, we've been exactly here before. Alan Bloom, the author of The Closing of the American Mind, compared the tyranny of feminism in academia to the Khmer Rouge. And he was writing at a time when women accounted for 10% of all college tenured faculty. It's worth looking back at what was considered annoyingly, outrageously politically correct in the 1980s, the last time we had this debate. You know, having to call, or not being able to call indigenous people, quote, Indians, or having to use hyphenated terms, at least in the United States, of terms like African Americans. You know, adding women or people of color to the Western Civ curriculum, not making gay jokes or using retard as an epithet. And I kind of get it, right? New concepts, new words sort of stick in your throat the way we're used to talking and thinking seem natural and normal, by definition. And then the new terms, new concepts that have social utility stick, and those that don't fall away. So if you go back to the 1970s, Ms., MS, as an alternative to Miss or Mrs. stuck around, and women with a Y didn't. And I think that someday, or I hope that someday, we'll look back and marvel at the idea that gender-neutral pronouns ever seemed like an existential threat to anyone. But I also don't think it's clear that, that might not happen, because if you look around the world right now, there are plenty of places that have indeed dialed back cosmopolitanism and reinstated patriarchy in the name of staving off chaos. And they seem like terrible places to live. I come to you from the United States, which is currently undergoing a monumental attempt to roll back social progress in the name of overcoming political correctness. And as someone who lives there, I assure you, it feels nothing like progress. Thank you.
Great start to the debate, Michelle. Thank you. I'm now going to ask Jordan Peterson to speak for the con team.
Hello. So we should first decide what we're talking about. We're not talking about my views of political correctness, despite what you might have inferred from the last speaker's comments. This is how it looks to me. We essentially need something approximating a low-resolution grand narrative to unite us. And we need a narrative to unite us because otherwise we don't have peace. What's playing out in the universities and in broader society right now is a debate between two fundamental low-resolution narratives, neither of which can be completely accurate because they can't encompass all the details. Obviously, human beings have an individual element and a collective element, a group element, let's say. The question is, what story should be paramount? And this is how it looks to me. In the West, we have reasonably functional, reasonably free, remarkably productive, stable hierarchies that are open to consideration of the dispossessed that hierarchies generally create. Our societies are freer and functioning more effectively than any societies anywhere else in the world, and than any societies ever have. And as far as I'm concerned, and I think there's good reason to assume this, it's because the fundamental low-resolution grand narrative that we've oriented ourselves around in the West is one of the sovereignty of the individual, and it's predicated on the idea that all things considered, the best way for me to interact with someone else is individual to individual, and to react to that person as if they're both part of the process, because that's the right way of thinking about it, the psychological process by which things we don't understand can yet be explored, and by things that aren't properly organized in our society can be yet set right. The reason we're valuable as individuals, both with regards to our rights and responsibilities, is because that's our essential purpose, and that's our nobility, and that's our function. What's happening, as far as I'm concerned, in the universities in particular, and spreading very rapidly out into the broader world, including the corporate world, much to what should be its chagrin, is a collectivist narrative. And of course, there's some utility in a collectivist narrative because we're all part of groups in different ways. But the collectivist narrative that I regard as politically correct is a strange pastiche of postmodernism and neo-Marxism. And its fundamental claim is that, no, you're not essentially an individual. You're essentially a member of a group. And that group might be your ethnicity, and it might be your sex, and it might be your race, and it might be any of the endless numbers of other potential groups that you belong to, because you belong to many of them. And that you should be essentially categorized along with those who are like you on that dimension in that group. That's proposition number one. Proposition number two is that the proper way to view the world is as a battleground between groups of different power. So you define the groups first, and then you assume that you view the individual from the group context, you view the battle between groups from the group context, and you view history itself as a consequence of nothing but the power maneuvers between different groups. That eliminates any consideration of the individual at a very fundamental level. And also any idea, for example, of free speech, because if you're collectivist at heart in this manner, there is no such thing as free speech. It isn't that it's debated by those on the radical left and let's say the rest of us, so to speak. It's that in that formulation, there's no such thing as free speech, because for an individualist, free speech is how you make sense of the world and reorganize society in a proper manner. But for the radical left type collectivist that's associated with this viewpoint of political correctness, when you speak, all you're doing is playing a power game on behalf of your group. And there's nothing else that you can do, because that's all there is. And not only is that all there is in terms of who you are as an individual now and how society should be viewed, it's also the fundamental narrative of history. For example, it's widely assumed in our universities now that the best way to conceptualize Western civilization is as an oppressive, male-dominated patriarchy, and that the best way to construe relationships between men and women across the centuries is one of oppression of women by men. It's like, well, look, no hierarchy is without its tyranny. That's an axiomatic truth. People have recognized that literally for thousands of years. And hierarchies do tend towards tyranny, and they tend towards the usurpation by people with power. But that only happens when they become corrupt. And we have mechanisms in our society to stop hierarchies from becoming intolerably corrupt, and they actually work pretty well. And so I would also point this out. You know, don't be thinking that this is a debate about whether empathy is useful or not, or that the people on the con side of the argument are not empathetic. I know perfectly well, as I'm sure Mr. Fry does, that hierarchies tend to produce situations where people stack up at the bottom, and that the dispossessed in hierarchies need a political voice, which is the proper voice of the left, by the way, and the necessary voice of the left. But that is not the same as proclaiming that the right level of analysis for our grand unifying narrative is that all of us are fundamentally to be identified by the groups that we belong to, and to construe the entire world as the battleground between different forms of tyranny in consequence of that group affiliation. And to the degree that we play out that narrative, that won't be progress, believe me, and we certainly haven't seen that progress in the universities. We've seen situations like what happened at Wilfrid Laurier University instead. We won't see progress. What we'll return to is exactly the same kind of tribalism that characterized the left.
Thank you, Jordan. Michael Eric Dyson, your 6 minutes starts now.
Thank you very kindly. Wonderful opportunity to be here in Canada. Thank you so much. I'm going to stand here at the podium. I'm a preacher. And I will ask for an offering at the end of my presentation. This is the swimsuit competition of the intellectual beauty pageant. So let me show you the curves of my thought. Oh my God, was that a politically incorrect statement I just made? How did we get to the point where the hijacking of the discourse on political correctness has become a kind of Manichaean distinction between us and them? The abortive fantasy just presented is remarkable for both its clarity and yet the muddiness of the context from which it has emerged. What's interesting to me is that when we look at the radical left, I'm saying, where they at? I want to join them. They ain't running nothing. I'm from a country where a man stands up every day to tweet the moral mendacity of his viciousness into a nation he has turned into his psychic commode. Y'all got Justin, we got Donald. So what's interesting then is that political correctness has transmogrified into a caricature of the left. The left came up with the term political correctness. Shall I remind you? We were tired of our excuses and our excesses and our exaggerations. We were willing to be self-critical in a way that I fear my confrères, my compatriots, are not. Don't take yourself too seriously. Smile. Take yourself not seriously at all, but what you do with deadly seriousness. Now it is transmogrified into an attempt to characterize the radical left. The radical left is a metaphor, it's a symbol, it's an articulation. They don't exist, their numbers are too small. I'm on college campuses, I don't see much of them coming. When I hear about identity politics, it amazes me. The collectivist identity politics, last time I checked, white folk invented race. That was an invention from a dominant culture that wanted groups at their behest. The invention of race was driven by the demand of a dominant culture to subordinate others. Right? Patriarchy was the demand of men to have their exclusive vision presented. The beauty of feminism is it's not going to resolve differences between men and women. It just says men don't automatically get the last word. Of course, in my crib, they never did. And so identity politics has been generated as a bête noire of the right, and yet the right doesn't understand the degree to which identity has been foisted upon black people and brown people and people of color from the very beginning on women and trans people. You think that I want to be part of a group that is constantly abhorred by people at Starbucks? I'm minding my own black business. Walking down the street, I have group identity thrust upon me. They don't say, ah, ha, ha. There goes a Negro. Highly intelligent, articulate, verbose, capable of rhetorical fury at the drop of a hat. We should not interrogate him as to the bona fides of his legal status. No, they treat me as part of a group. And the problem is that our friends don't want to acknowledge is that the hegemony, the dominance of that group has been so vicious that it has denied us the opportunity to exist as individuals. Individualism is the characteristic moment in modernity. Mr. Peterson is right. The development of the individual, however, is predicated upon notions of intelligence. Immanuel Kant and David Hume and others, philosophically, Descartes comes along, introducing knowledge into the phrase, saying that knowledge is based upon a kind of reference to the golden intelligence, the reflective glass that one possesses, and yet it got rooted in the very ground of our existence. So knowledge has fleshly basis, and what I'm saying to you, the knowledge that I bring as a person of color makes a difference in my body because I know what people think of me and I know how they respond to me, and that ain't no theory. Am I mad at trigger warnings? The only trigger warning I want is from a cop. Are you about to shoot me? Not funny. In America, where young black people die repeatedly, unarmed, without provocation. And so for me, identity politics is something very serious. And what's interesting about safe spaces, I hear about the university. I teach there. Look, if you're in a safe space in your body, you don't need a safe space. Some of that is overblown. Some of it is ridiculous. I understand. I believe that the classroom is a robust place for serious learning. I believe in the interrogation of knowledge based upon our understanding mutually of the edifying proposition of enlightenment. At the same time, some people ain't as equal as others. So we have to understand the conditions under which they have emerged and in which they have been benighted and attacked by their own culture. And I ain't seen nobody be a bigger snowflake than white men who complain. Mommy, they won't let us play and have everything we used to have under the old regime where we were racist and supremacists and dominant and patriarchs and hated gays and lesbians and transsexuals that, yeah, you gotta share. This ain't your world, this everybody's world. And let me end by saying this. You remember that story from David Foster Wallace? Fish are going down, two fish are going, and an older fish comes in the opposite direction. He said, hello, boys, how's the water? They swim on, they turn to each other, what the hell is water? Because when you're in it, you don't know it. When you're dominant, you don't know it. Nothing, Kaiser Soze said, is more interesting that the devil did than to make people believe he didn't exist. That's what white supremacy is.
Thank you, Michael. Stephen, you're up. We're going to put 6 minutes on the clock, and please start.
Yes, I'll try and be as quick as possible, because if I miss that plane to London, I won't half hear the end of it from the bridegroom's mother. Now, in agreeing to participate in this debate and stand on this side of the argument, I'm fully aware that many people who choose incorrectly, in my view, to see this issue in terms of left and right, devalued and exploded terms as I think they are, will believe that I am betraying myself in such causes and values that I have espoused over the years. I've been given huge grief already simply because I'm standing here next to Professor Peterson, which is the very reason that I am standing here in the first place. I'm standing next to someone with whom I have differences, shall we say, in terms of politics and all kinds of other things, precisely because I think all this has got to stop. This rage, resentment, hostility, intolerance, above all this with us or against us, certainty. A Grand Canyon has opened up in our world. The fissure, the crack, grows wider every day. Neither on each side can hear a word that the other shrieks, and nor do they want to. While these armies and propagandists in the culture wars clash, down below in the enormous space between the two sides, the people of the world try to get on with their lives, alternately baffled, bored, and betrayed by the horrible noises and explosions that echo all around. I think it's time for this toxic, binary, zero-sum madness to stop before we destroy ourselves. I'd better nail my colours to the mast before I get any further in this. It's only polite to give you a sense of where I come from. All my adult life, I have been what you might call a lefty, a soft lefty, a liberal of the most hand-wringing milksop, milquetoast variety. Not a burning man-the-barricade socialist, not even really a progressive worth the name. I've been on marches, but I've never quite dared wave placards or banners. Am I a loathed member of that band, an SJW, a social justice warrior? I don't think highly of social injustice, I have to say, but I character myself mostly as a social justice warrior. My intellectual heroes growing up were Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, liberal thinkers, people like that, writers like E.M. Forster. I believed, and I think I still do believe, in the sanctity of human relations, of the primacy of the heart and friendship and love and common interest. These are more personal, interior beliefs than they are political exterior convictions, more a humanistic version of a religious impulse, I suppose. I trust in humanity. I believe in humanity. I think I do, despite all that has happened in the 40 years of my adulthood. I am soft, and I can easily be swept away by harder hearts and harder intellects. I'm sometimes surprised to be described as an activist, but over time I have energetically involved myself with what you might call causes. I grew up knowing that I was gay. Well, in fact, from the very first I knew I was gay. I remember when I was born looking up and saying, that's the last time I'm going up one of those. I'm Jewish. So I have a natural, obviously, horror of racism. I want racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, bullying, bigotry, intolerance of all humankinds to end. That's surely a given amongst all of us. The question is how such a golden aim is to be achieved. My ultimate objection to political correctness is not that it combines so much of what I have spent a lifetime loathing and opposing, preachiness, with great respect, piety, self-righteousness, heresy hunting, denunciation, shaming, assertion without evidence, accusation, inquisition, censoring. That's not why I'm incurring the wrath of my fellow liberals by standing on this side of the House. My real objection is that I don't think political correctness works. I want to get to the Golden Hill, but I don't think that's the way to get there. I believe one of the greatest human failings is to prefer to be right than to be effective. And political correctness is always obsessed with how right it is without thinking of how effective it might be. I wouldn't class myself as a classical libertarian, but I do relish transgression, and I deeply and instinctively distrust conformity and orthodoxy. Progress is not achieved by preachers and guardians of morality, but, to paraphrase Yevgeny Zemyatin, by madmen, hermits, heretics, dreamers, rebels, and skeptics. I may be wrong. I hope to learn this evening. I really do think I may be wrong, but I'm prepared to entertain the possibility that political correctness will bring us more tolerance and a better world. but I'm not sure. And I would like this quotation from my hero Bertrand Russell to hover over the evening. One of the painful things about our time is that those who feel certainty are stupid, and those with any imagination and understanding are filled with doubt and indecision. Let doubt prevail.
So, great set of opening statements to set the scene. We're now going to go into a round of rebuttals to allow each of our presenters 3 minutes to reflect on what they've heard and to make some additional points. We're going to do that in the same order that we had the opening statements. So, Michelle, you're up first. We'll put 3 minutes on the clock for you.
So first, I would say that I think that the attempt to draw a dichotomy between individual rights and group rights is a little bit misleading. Traditionally, there have been large groups of people who have not been able to exercise their individual rights. And I think that a lot of the claims that are being made on behalf of what we politically correct types call marginalized groups are claims that people who, have identities that have not traditionally been at the center of our culture or been at the top of our hierarchies have as much right to exercise their individual talents and realize their individual ambitions, right? When we say that we want more women in power or more people of color's voices in the canon or in the curriculum or directing movies, all of these things are not because, at least on my part, I'm interested in some sort of very crude equity, but because there are a lot of people who have not traditionally been able to realize themselves as individuals. That's what the women's movement was. That's what the civil rights movement was. That's what the gay rights movement was. That's in some ways what the trans rights movement was. I mean, far from a collectivist movement, this is kind of liberalism, classical liberalism, pushed to its extreme, right? These are people saying, I have the right to define my identity against the one that was collectively assigned to me. Finally, I would say, a lot of the things that Stephen Fry said, and particularly his temperament, were probably in agreement, but this inquisition, this censoriousness, on the one hand, I see where he's coming from, but I think it's a little bit virtual, right? I mean, who's really censoring you? I understand what it feels like to feel censored. I understand what it feels like to be on the wrong side of a Twitter mob or get a lot of nasty comments. And that's a bad feeling, and it's a counterproductive tactic, but that's not censorship. And again, it's especially strange coming from a country where the President of the United States is trying to levy additional postal rates on the owner of the Washington Post, in revenge for its reporting. And people who have kneeled to protest police brutality at football games have seen their careers explode. Or people who have, women who have challenged Mr. Peterson have been hounded by threats and trolls and misogynist invective. So, thank you.
Jordan, we're going to have 3 minutes up on the screen there. Please respond to what you've heard.
Well, I guess I would like to set out a challenge in somewhat the same format as Mr. Fry did to people on the moderate left. I mean, I've studied totalitarianism for a very long time, both on the left and on the right in various forms. And I think we've done a pretty decent job of determining when right-wing beliefs become dangerous. I think that they become dangerous when the people who stand on the right evoke notions of racial superiority or ethnic superiority, something like that. It's fairly easy to draw a box around them and place them to one side and necessary, and I think we've done a pretty good job of that. What I fail to see happening on the left, and this is with regards to the sensible left, because such a thing exists, is for the same thing to happen with regards to the radical leftists. Okay, so here's an open question. If it's not diversity inclusivity, and equity as a triumvirate that mark out the too excessive left, and with equity defined, by the way, not as equality of opportunity, which is an absolutely laudable goal, but as equality of outcome, which is how it's defined, then exactly how do we demarcate the too extreme left? What do? We say, well, there's no such thing as the too extreme left? Well, that's certainly something that characterized much of intellectual thinking for the 20th century, as our high-order intellectuals, especially in places like France, did everything they could to bend over backwards to ignore absolutely everything that was happening in the catastrophic left world, in the Soviet Union and in Maoist China, not least. We've done a terrible job of determining how to demarcate what's useful from the left from what's pathological. And so it's perfectly okay for someone to criticize my attempts to identify something like a boundary. We could say diversity, inclusivity, and equity, especially equity, which is in fact equality of outcome, which is an absolutely abhorrent notion. If you know anything about history, you know that. And I'm perfectly willing to hear some reasonable alternatives, but what I hear continually from people on the left, first of all, as my opponents did, to construe every argument that is possibly able to be construed on the axis of group identification, and to fail to help the rest of us differentiate the reasonable left, which stands for the oppressed, necessarily, from the pathological left that's capable of unbelievable destruction. And what I see happening in the university campuses in particular, where the leftists absolutely predominate, and that's certainly not my imagination, that's well documented by perfectly reasonable people like Jonathan Haidt, is an absolute failure to make precisely that distinction. And I see the same thing echoed tonight. Thank you.
Michael, give us your rebuttal.
Let me step out here in Peterson land. I feel freer already. I don't know what mythological collective Mr. Peterson refers to. I'm part of the left. They're cantankerous. When they have a firing squad, it's usually in a semicircle. Part of the skepticism of rationality was predicated upon the Enlightenment Project, which says we're no longer going to be subordinate to skepticism, to superstition. We're going to think, and we're going to think well. Thomas Jefferson was one of the great arbiters of rationality, but he was also a man who was a slave owner. How do you reconcile that? That's the complication I'm speaking about. That's not either or. That's not a collective identity. Thomas Jefferson believed in a collective identity, that is, during the day. At night, he got some Luther Vandross songs, went out to the slave quarter, and engaged in sexual relations and had many children with Sally Hemings. His loins trumped his logic. And when he talks about postmodernism, I don't know who he's talking about. I teach postmodernism. It's kind of fun. Jacques Derrida, just to say his name is beautiful. Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault talked about the insurrection of subjugated knowledges, people who had been marginalized now beginning to speak. The subaltern, as Gayatri Spivak talks about it in post-colonial theory. The reason these people grew up and grew into existence and had a voice is because they were denied. As Ms. Goldberg said, our group identity was foisted upon us. We were not seen as individuals. Babe Ruth, when he broke the home run record, he didn't bat against all best ball players. He batted against the best white ball players. When it's been rigged in your favor from the very beginning, it's hard for you to understand how much you've been rigged. You're born on third base, think you hit a triple at the Toronto Blue Jays game. And here we are deriving our sense of identity from the very culture that we ignore. Look at the indigenous names and the First Nation names: Toronto, Saskatchewan, Winnipeg, Tim Hortons. But I'll tell you, there's an envy of the kind of freedom and liberty that people of color and other minorities bring because we bring the depth of knowledge in our body. There's a kind of jealousy of that. As the greatest living Canadian philosopher, Aubrey Drake Graham, says, jealousy is just love and hate at the same time. And so for me, I think it's necessary. I agree with Mr. Fry. We shouldn't be nasty and combative. And yet, I don't see nastiness and combativeness from people. I see them making a desire to have their individual identities respected. When I get shot down for no other reason than I'm black, when I get categorized for no other reason than my color, I am living in a culture that refuses to see me as a great individual.
No, it's interesting to hear that there really doesn't seem to be a problem, but yet I think we all instinctively know that there is some kind of a problem. There isn't censorship. Of course not in the way that there is in Russia. I've been to Russia. I faced off with a deeply homophobic and unpleasant man, and there's political correctness in Russia. It's just political correctness on the right. And that's what I grew up with, political correctness, which meant that you couldn't say certain things on television. You couldn't say fuck, for example, on television, because it was incorrect to do so. And as always, the same reason was that someone would appear and say, I'm not shocked. Oh, of course, no, I'm not shocked. I'm not offended. I'm offended on behalf of others, young, impressionable, plastic minds, the vulnerable. And that's not good enough. It's so often people are saying, you see, I don't mind being called a faggot or a kike or whatever, or a mad person, because I've got mental health issues. I don't mind people insulting me. And people say, well, that's all right for you, Stephen, because you know you're strong. Well, I don't feel particularly strong, and I don't know that I like being called a faggot and a kike particularly, but I don't believe that the advances in my culture that have allowed me to marry, as I have now been for 3 years, to someone of my gender, I don't believe they are a result of political correctness. And maybe political correctness is actually just some sort of live trout, that the harder we squeeze it, the further it goes away. And you will be saying, I'm not talking about political correctness, you're talking about social justice, with which I agree, with whether you want to call it identity politics or the history of your people, the history of my people were slaves as well. Both the British were slaves of Romans and the Jews were slaves of the Egyptians. All human beings have been slaves at some point, and we all, in that sense, share that knowledge of how important it is to speak up. But Russell Means, who was a friend of mine towards the end, who founded the American Indian movement, he said, oh, for God's sake, call me an Indian or a Lakota Sioux or Russell. I don't care what you call me. It's how we're treated that matters. And so I'm really addressing a more popular idea. Also, actually, in Barrow, Alaska, an Inupiat said, call me an Eskimo. It's obviously easier for you because you keep mispronouncing Inupiat. You know, words do matter. I'll just end with a quick story. Gay rights came about in England because we slowly and persistently knocked on the door of people in power. We didn't shout, we didn't scream. People like Ian McKellen eventually got to see the Prime Minister. And when the Queen signed in the royal assent, as she has to, for the bill allowing equality of marriage, she said, Lord, you know, I couldn't imagine this in 1953. Really is extraordinary, isn't it? Just wonderful. And handed it over. Now, it's a nice story, and I hope it's true, but it's nothing to do with political correctness. It's to do with human decency. It's that simple.
Good. So.